All right, so I'm going to give you fair warning as we get started. You are going to be required, you are going to have to think in this message. I know I just lost like half of the audience. You just checked out completely. But seriously, I've got some good stuff in here, so you can't be lazy. I think this is great. And just so you know, here's another potential benefit. I'm really excited about this stuff, so when I tend to talk faster, which means a shorter video. Many of you already watched this on 2x speed anyway, so you can get through the sermon stuff quicker. So there's an added benefit for you, but you are going to have to think. So top off the coffee, slap your little sleepy faces awake, shake off the cobwebs, and tune in. Are you ready? All right, I'll start this way. I'm breaking our deal. I'm going to break the deal that I made with you a few weeks ago when I wrapped up the series Wisdom in the Storm. You remember that little mini-series that we did? And I told you I wasn't going to talk about to you what it is that we've all been hearing about 24/7 for the last several months. I'm breaking that deal. I have to bring it up only, well, you'll see why, because it's setting the stage for what I want to talk about today. And I'm not actually bringing it up myself. I'm simply, I'm really trying to justify myself here. I'm simply reading to you quotes from newspapers. That's all I'm doing here, or news sites, okay? We'll start with the lead line of a Wall Street Journal piece back in March of this year. You'll remember March. It was the month that went on for 7 months. Here's what the Wall Street Journal wrote. Sometimes the most important ingredient for spiritual renewal is a cataclysmic event. They aren't alone. Christianity Today posted this hopeful headline. Will COVID-19 lead to the next great American awakening? National Review ran a piece in early April. It was entitled, The Great Coronavirus Spiritual Awakening? And even the Jerusalem Post had a byline that said, Coronavirus has a spiritual effect. So what to make of all of this talk of a spiritual revival taking place, not just in America, but around the world? Well, there are all kinds of different theories and different guesses that are out there, but for my money, I think this all comes down to exactly what Paul told the Colossians in his letter to them. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. All things find their meaning in him. They were created by him, thus they were animated by him. Therefore, apart from him, or if you try to remove him, if you try to remove God from the whole puzzle that we've got going here, we're going to find dissonance. Another way of saying that is maybe a little less intellectual, so you don't have to think quite as hard on this point. If God is the one that formed this whole thing, and he wove himself into the various tapestries that we see all around us in creation, if he's the glue that holds it all together, when you try to live as though there is no glue, well, everything's going to fall apart. Without God, or trying to imagine this world without God, it's just weird. That's the sermon for today. Life is weird without God. Now, what does that have to do with the spiritual awakening supposedly or apparently or potentially taking place? Well, it's pretty simple. 3 months ago, there was enough happening, enough going on, enough filling our lives and our schedules and our day planners that we could ignore God. I mean, you and I could, and if we could, as believers, think how easily it was for people who don't even really believe in his existence to go on about their lives as though there was no God. We were just too busy to notice him or the emptiness that exists when he isn't an integral part of our lives. Well, what's happened these last few months is that people around the world, not just here, but around the world, they've had a lot more time to think and to consider their own mortality. Even the proudest, most arrogant minds among us, the ones that think that they have all of the answers, they have come face to face with their own helplessness. Now, they'll never admit it, but they have. They've realized they are not in control of their own fate. You remember, and maybe you don't, but several months ago in the course of a sermon, I brought up the fact that there are like 30 trillion cells that are actively doing their little cell thing in our bodies. You remember I mentioned the Golgi bodies, how they were my favorite, and that I complimented Jenny on her Golgi bodies when we first got together? Okay, anyway. 30 trillion cells, and they're all doing their cell thing here. And how many do we control? Not a single one. Nobody, prior to this reality of which we do not speak, nobody had time to think about that until they had nothing but time to think about that. And when you honestly start to think about it, life makes a lot more sense with God as a part of it than it will when you try to remove him from it. Everything fits together far more reasonably with the existence of God in the picture than if you try to paint a picture of reality, of what we live, without him. And by the way, I don't mean this spiritually. Gavin Ortlund wrote a great piece on this years before this whole pandemic stuff. I don't mean spiritually. I mean logically, practically, reasonably. C.S. Lewis explored this in his fiction writing almost half a century ago. If God doesn't exist, so much of life, so much of what we simply assume in our everyday existence, in the way that we function, that stuff that we just assume becomes really mysterious and becomes inexplicable. And look, if we're busy, we don't have time to notice, wait a minute, that doesn't really make any sense. But when we're not busy and we're all sitting at home and we just start thinking about it, God puts these pieces together a lot better than all these other silly stories that I've heard. Now, I'm going to get into what I'm talking about and give you some examples, but please understand that I'm not suggesting these realities, these things that I mention that are weird without the existence of God. This isn't proof of God's existence. You can still create a storyline that tries to make sense out of it, but these are just parts of life that are uncomfortably out of place. They're awkward. They're just plain weird to think about if for some reason God didn't exist. And I think that's what more people may be coming to acknowledge right now, which is causing that uptick in a belief of a spiritual awakening. Let's start with what you're doing right now. Well, hopefully doing. Some of you, I don't think so. But thought. If our brains are nothing but the result of some natural, undesigned, chemical, evolutionary process, then the ability to think and give thought that directs our actions, that becomes very strange. You see, because in naturalism, in natural selection, the effort to pass on our genes, to procreate, to extend our own lives, that becomes everything. Our genes direct everything and determines everything that we do. It's the one law of nature, the law of self-preservation. So if that's what drives everything, then what exactly is thought? Where did it come from? And what good is it? It's not needed. And how did it just generate itself from a physical process? You see, I think some normal people are starting to encounter things like that in their quiet moments. But truthfully, this is something that an issue that philosophers have grappled with for centuries, and atheist philosophers have really struggled to try to make sense out of. Thomas Nagel, who doubts the existence of God, he's one of these philosophers. He wrote a text called The Introduction to Philosophy. It's this epic work. He admits this in his writing. He says, "There seem to me two very different kinds of things going on in the world. The things that belong to physical reality, which many different people can observe from the outside, and those other things that belong to mental reality, which each of us experiences from the inside in his own case." All right, let me try to make all this make sense to you. There are certain mental realities that are true for all of us, regardless of the physical world. 2 + 3 = 5, correct? I'm really hoping you said yes. So here's the question. Is there anything that could happen to this world physically that would cause 2 + 3 to equal anything other than 5? No. The entire Earth could be pulverized by an asteroid, obliterated, and 2 plus 3 would still equal 5. Even if physical existence ceased to be, even if the entire universe evaporated and was gone, 2 plus 3 would still equal 5, because it's not dependent upon a physical reality. The world of numbers is a mental, fixed, universal reality, and it's binding. So where did it come from? What is this intellectual mental world that rises up all around us like some invisible castle? How did it get here? Who put it there? And why is it binding on each of us? Okay, with the existence of God, a grand mind behind the universe, all of that makes sense. Without God, thought seems totally out of place. It doesn't make sense. Here's a second thing to consider. Also, what you're doing right now, choice. You're making the choice to continue watching me, I think. It's distinctly possible that I'm just out here talking to myself. But why? Not why are you continuing to watch me, which I don't think anybody could explain. I mean, why should it even be possible for you to make that choice? How can you make any choice?
Paper or plastic? Paper, I guess.
You see, if the universe is all bound by science and cause and effect, then ultimately everything happens because of a prior material cause. It's like one pool ball hits two pool balls and they spread out this way, and then those two pool balls hit four other pool balls and then they explode outward from there, and all of these things are happening because something else happened before it, and it replicates down the line. That is determinism. That is, everything was set in motion and it happens according to these physical realities of science. There's a famous explanation of this notion. It's called chaos theory. This idea that something minute, something like a butterfly flapping its wings on the other side of the world, that can cause enough tiny, imperceptible changes in the atmosphere that it can slowly start to have an effect outwards, to the point that little things start affecting other little things, which start making bigger impacts and bigger impacts, to the point that a butterfly flapping its wings in Africa can cause or can prevent the formation of a tornado in Kansas. And then that tornado forming in Kansas is going to determine what it is that you and I do, whether we go to the park that day, depending on the weather forecast. And then if we don't go to the park, that's less people that will not be breathing in that, and this affects this, that, and the other. And all of that governs life. Everything is determined by science. Cause and effect. This pool ball hitting this pool ball, which then hit this pool ball, which caused this. That's the materialistic explanation.
That's chaos theory.
Materialistic determinism. I think the best way to understand it is like a Rube Goldberg machine. All of these elaborate things happen. All these elaborate processes take place to result in one tiny, seemingly insignificant consequence. Why did you tie your shoe this morning? Well, the scientific explanation is because a butterfly fluttered its wings, it started off this Rube Goldberg machine that all of these elaborate things happened, which resulted in this seemingly insignificant consequence of you tying your shoe. And since our brains are physical entities, that becomes the vehicle, the principle behind a godless explanation for how we do things or make decisions. It's all driven by chemicals, physical realities. Our brains are wired to the evolutionary process, survival of the fittest, self-preservation. So ultimately, we don't really choose anything. That's what's meant by the term determinism. We don't really have free will. We just do what we must to survive and perpetuate human existence. Now, when people are worried about making it to ball games and grilling on their grill in the summer, they're not thinking about those things. But when they're holed up in their home and they start thinking about their own mortality, they start thinking about the big questions, something like that isn't really going to compute. I mean, this philosophy runs into some real problems, does it not? First of all, if we're bound by nature to act in certain ways, then there is no real choice. But if we have no real choice, then how can we say that anything is right or wrong? If a butterfly flapping its wings in Africa set in motion a course of events that culminated with you punching me in the face,
Dad?
well, how can I be mad at you about that? How can I hold you accountable? How can anyone punish you or say what you did was wrong when you ultimately had no choice? You were forced to do it by the physical realities. You quickly realize that without choice, then there will be no justice. And yet justice is something that really seems hardwired into the human heart. Notice I said human heart. There's something distinct about humans that isn't present in the animal world. You don't see dolphins going on trial in Little Dolphin Court. Something distinct about humanity. But again, the scientific explanation, we are all just animals. So why do we have this sense of justice that other beings don't? And consider that these last few months, they have demonstrated some real holes in this philosophy as well. Specifically, this. Why would people who are hardwired simply to self-preserve, to survive at all costs, who don't have the free will to make their own decisions and choices, because that would violate the scientific laws that they can't violate, why would they volunteer to go set up a tent in a park in a city overrun by a disease and risk their own lives to help sick and dying people caught up with a deadly contagion? Why would someone leap from a bridge into an icy river to try to save the life of a mom and a kid who drove off the bridge 5 minutes before and probably are dead already? Where does altruism, generosity, charity, self-sacrifice, where do these free will choices come from? And why? You see, without God, choice doesn't exist. But look around the world. To try to explain this world without the existence of choice, that's just weird. Finally, let me hit you with this one. Hope. Apart from God, hope makes no sense. It's weird and it's pointless. And yet, we know how very powerful of a reality hope is in human life. Ask a Holocaust survivor like Viktor Frankl, who famously said, "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how." Do even a modicum of research into suicide rates and suicide causes, and you will see how frighteningly often the term hopelessness is associated with those who make the choice, tragically, to end their own existence. Human beings need hope to live. Something to look forward to, something to count on, something to live for. I came to realize this when I watched a movie in high school that was a favorite of many of my best friends in high school. It's called The Shawshank Redemption. Maybe you've seen it. The lead character is sentenced to a prison term in a notorious prison called Shawshank after he's found guilty of committing a heinous crime that he didn't actually commit. It seems like a hopeless situation for him, but it's hope that saves him, and not just him. After he escapes from prison...
You just completely ruined the show for me. Bro, what am I going to watch now? You have to say spoiler alert, dude. You can't just do that.
He leaves a note for one of his friends that he had when he was incarcerated. Friend's name was Red. It's played by the actor Morgan Freeman. Well, years later, when Red gets out on parole, he tries to live a normal life on the outside, but he has no friends. He doesn't really understand what the point of it is, and so he's going to kill himself. But before he does, he finds the note from Andy, and this is what it says.
Dear Red, if you're reading this, you've gotten out. And if you've come this far, maybe you're willing to come a little further. You remember the name of the town, don't you?
Zihuatanejo.
I could use a good man to help me get my project on wheels. I'll keep an eye out for you, and the chessboard ready. Remember, Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies.
You see, that line rings true for us, for all of us. But without God, should it ring true? In a world without God, hope does die. Everything dies. Just wait long enough and there's no one around to do any hoping. In fact, not only will every individual person die, but the entire universe, we're told, is going to die in a massive heat death. And when it burns up, so will every single achievement of every single person, all to be forgotten forever. That is hopeless. So here's a serious question. If we live in a physical world that is ultimately hopeless, how can a world that is ultimately hopeless, devoid of any hope, produce creatures that simply cannot function without it? With God, it all makes sense. Peter writes, "And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." See, without God, hope seems really out of place. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He once wrote these words: "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains." Now notice there, according to Lewis and his observation, God's speech is not always at the same volume. The clarity and the force of divine revelation, it varies depending on the circumstance. See, if someone asks me why I'm convinced of the existence of God, I'm not sure any of these things, thought or choice or hope, I'm not sure any of them are going to be at the top of my list of reasons why I believe in the existence of God. I think they fit in, but I'm not suggesting to you that I think they're the strongest arguments for God's existence. But I want you to remember where we started today. Some people are noticing in the midst of all of the uncertainty and all of the pain that we have seen these last few months around the globe, that we are experiencing a move towards God, a move towards spirituality. And the question was why? Maybe this is why. Maybe in the confusing quiet, people have had time to think about thinking, to think about choosing, to think about hoping. And while they've been doing that, they've heard someone whispering. Maybe you're hearing the same. I pray that you are. Church, I have been so anxious to say this for so long. God bless you, and I cannot wait to see you in person next week.